I arrived in Stalingrad with the smell of smoke already heavy in the air. The train that brought us rattled to a halt miles from the city, and from there we marched the rest of the way, boots crunching through snow that had long since turned gray with ash. I was 21, though I felt older after the campaigns in the West. Still, the men beside me joked nervously, their laughter brittle, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something waiting in the ruins ahead. They told us the city would fall quickly. That was the promise we carried, a phrase repeated so often by our officers that it sounded less like strategy and more like prayer. But as we approached the smoking horizon, I saw a place that looked less like a city and more like the skeleton of one. Buildings were hollowed out, their windows blackened sockets. The streets were littered with the twisted remains of trams and carts. Dogs picked at scraps, but even they seemed gaunt and half-starved. The first shelling hit as we entered. We dropped to the ground instinctively, though I remembered the older sergeant shouting that if we lay in the snow too long, we'd defreeze faster than we'd be killed by shrapnel. The blast tore a chimney from a house and sent bricks cascading into the street. When I lifted my head, I saw the body of a boy no older than 16 lying face down where the road had split. He wore no uniform, only a torn coat. Our medic crouched beside him, then shook his head once. Night, we took shelter in the remains of a school. The chalkboard was still mounted on one wall, its surface scarred with bullet holes. Someone had written a half-reached equation in white chalk, the numbers now ghostly in the candlelight. I ran my fingers over them, wondering who had solved sums in that room only months before. The thought unsettled me more than the gunfire outside. War had reached into places of learning, tearing apart futures we would never know. The fighting was nothing like I had imagined. It was not a matter of advancing or retreating, it was clawing for every room, every stairwell, as if the very bones of the city resisted us. We cleared houses with grenades and bayonets, only to lose them again within hours. At times, we fought Russians who were only a wall away. Gotta hear them breathe, cough, sometimes even laugh. They knew the terrain as if it were an extension of their own bodies, and they moved like shadows through the ruins. One evening, my unit was ordered to cross a narrow street that was swept by enemy fire. We ran one at a time, crouched low, the snow spraying under our boots. The man ahead of me fell midway, his body jerking as bullets struck him. I froze for an instant, staring at him twitch in the snow, before the sergeant shoved me forward with a curse. I ran then, faster than I thought possible, and threw myself against the wall on the other side. My chest heaved, my heart drumming so hard it drowned out the rest of the world. It was my first real taste of the city's appetite for men. At night, the temperature dropped so low that our breath hung thick around us like smoke. We huddled together for warmth, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Hunger gnawed at us, but in those early days, we still had bread, canned meat, and coffee, though each portion grew smaller with every passing sunrise. The officers told us supplies were coming. We believed them then. We had to. The city itself seemed alive. Its ruins groaned under the weight of frost, and the wind whistled through shattered windows like voices. Sometimes, as I stood guard, I felt as though the rubble stared back at me, the jagged walls forming grim faces in the moonlight. I was not a superstitious man, but Stalingrad tested more than flesh, pressed into the mind until every shadow whispered. One night, as I scribbled a few lines into a small notebook I carried, I caught myself writing not about the enemy, but about home. I could see my mother's kitchen, the smell of warm bread, the creak of the wooden floor. The memory was so vivid, it hurt. Snapped the book shut, ashamed of the longing, afraid the others might see weakness in my eyes. We were told we were soldiers of steel, but in truth, we were flesh, freezing and fragile in a city that swallowed steel whole. That was my first week in Stalingrad. Already, I understood that victory would not come quickly. What I did not yet realize was that survival itself would become the only goal worth clinging to. The days bled together in a haze of hunger, smoke, and cold. We no longer spoke of winning the war, only of finding the next scrap of food or patch of warmth that might carry us one more night. Each morning began with the same ritual. Shake the man beside you and pray he stirs. Too often, the answer was silence, his face stiff, his lips blue. When that happened, there was no time for ceremony. We took what we could, boots, gloves, perhaps even a ration from his pocket hand, moved on. Survival allowed no other choice. Our rations thinned until they became a cruel joke. What once was bread became a crust no larger than a coin, hard as wood and dry enough to cut the gums. We boiled strips of leather torn from belts and sat chewing them like old dogs, gnawing bones. The water itself was often fouled, drawn from melted snow tainted with ash and blood. Some men swore they saw worms writhing in the bottom of their canteens, though none of us poured it out. We drank because thirst was stronger than disgust. One afternoon, a comrade named Muller brought in a crow. He had caught near the ruins of a warehouse. His feathers were ragged, one wing broken. He wrung its neck, and we cooked it over a small fire made from splintered floorboards. The meat was stringy, bitter, but it filled our bellies. For the first time in weeks, laughter flickered around the circle. We tore at the bones greedily, even sucking the marrow. And for a fleeting hour, it felt as though life still clung to us. But hunger always returned. It was a constant ache, a hollow drum that never ceased. Some men began to speak in whispers of stealing from others, even from the dead. I caught one soldier, slipping bread from a sleeping comrade's pack. The sergeant beat him bloody for it, yet none of us judged him harshly. We understood, hunger bends a man's honor until it snaps. The cold was a second enemy, no less ruthless than the Russians across the street. Frost crept into our fingers and toes, despite every layer we wrapped around them. I remember peeling off my boot one evening to find my big toe blackened, as if ink had seeped into the flesh. The medic told me to rub snow on it and keep moving, else the rot spread further. I obeyed, but the pain was like fire and ice at once, a constant reminder that my body itself was betraying me. At night, the temperature dropped so low that our rifles froze. We had to sleep with them tucked beneath our coats, close to our chests, or the bolts would jam come morning. Even so, I once saw a man urinate on his rifle to thaw the mechanism, cursing through clenched teeth as steam rose from the steel. Such acts became normal. Dignity had no place in Stalingrad. The city grew quieter as weeks passed, though not with peace. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crack of a sniper's bullet or the distant thunder of artillery. Whole districts lay deserted, filled with the frozen bodies of men who had once fought over them. The snow covered their faces, but not their shapes, and sometimes I stumbled over them as I searched for firewood. Each time, I muttered an apology, though I no longer knew if it was for them or for myself. Disease crept in with the cold and hunger. Lice spread through our ranks, biting us raw beneath our uniforms. Dysentery stole what little strength we had left. The stench of unwashed bodies and rotting wounds hung over every shelter like a curse. The medics worked tirelessly, but they had no medicine, only rags and hope. Some men begged to be shot rather than endured the slow decay of fever. More than once, I wondered if I would do the same, should sickness find me. Despite everything, there were moments, small, fragile sparks, that reminded me we were still human. Once, during a lull in the fighting, a Russian voice called across the rubble in broken German, "You cold too?" There was a pause, then laughter, grim, tired, but laughter nonetheless, from both sides. No shots were fired that night. For a brief time, the war seemed to hold its breath, and I lay awake, wondering if the man who spoke had a family waiting, as I did. Did he dream of home? Did he curse the same hunger gnawing at my gut? But such moments never lasted. The next day, gunfire resumed, as if nothing had passed between us. I grew thin, my uniform hanging loose, my cheeks hollow. My reflection in a shard of glass startled me. I looked more like a prisoner than a soldier. The others were the same ghosts in gray coats, trudging through snow, eyes sunken and wild. Hope was a word none dared speak aloud, for it seemed too fragile, like glass that might shatter if touched. By then, rumors spread among us, supplies cut off, encirclement tightening, the promise of rescue, nothing but a cruel illusion. Still, the officers barked orders, insisting we hold our ground. We obeyed because disobedience meant a bullet in the back. Yet each of us knew the truth, that Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a trap, and we were the prey, waiting to be starved, frozen, or buried in rubble. And still, every morning I awoke, teeth chattering, stomach twisting in knots, and whispered the same words to myself. Not today. I will not die today. It was the only prayer I had left. The enemy was never far. They were in the next street, the next ruined building, sometimes no more than a wall's thickness away. I could hear them cough at night, the scrape of boots on rubble, the murmurs of their voices. It was like living beside shadows, always present, always near, yet unseen until the moment of fire. We fought for houses like wolves, tearing at scraps of meat. A single room could cost half a platoon. Once, we stormed the ground floor of a factory, while Russians held the second. We threw grenades upstairs, and they hurled Molotovs down in return. The fire lit the walls orange and filled the stairwell with smoke so thick we could barely breathe. For hours, we fought over nothing more than stair steps until both sides fell back, too exhausted to finish what we had started. I remember one night in particular. We were positioned in a collapsed building, its roof long gone, walls jagged like broken teeth. Snow drifted in through the gaps, dust in the floor where we huddled. Around midnight, we heard movement boots crunching slowly in the snow outside. The sergeant raised his hand, and we gripped our rifles. My heart hammered so loud, I thought it might betray me. The figures came closer, 3 of them, stepping carefully through the rubble. I leveled my rifle, ready to fire, but then one stumbled and cursed softly in German. Relief washed over me, though it left me trembling. Had it been Russians, we would have opened fire in that instant, and perhaps they would have to. Death was always just a breath away, waiting for the wrong sound, the wrong shadow. But not every encounter ended so mercifully. In the ruins of an apartment block, I once came face to face with a Russian soldier. We both froze, rifles half raised, too close to aim properly. His eyes were wide, mine surely the same. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then instinct shattered hesitation. He lunged with his bayonet, and I swung my rifle like a club. The clash echoed through the stairwell. I don't remember the details clearly, only the desperate struggle. His breath hot on my cheek, my hands slipping on the frozen wood. When it ended, he lay still on the floor, and I stood, shaking, the bayonet slick in my grip. I didn't feel triumph, only sickness. He could have been me, a boy pulled from his home, given a rifle, told to fight until nothing remained. I stared at his face longer than I should have, memorizing it without meaning to. And even now, when I close my eyes, I see him. Snipers were the worst. You never saw them, only the aftermath. A man walking beside you one moment would crumple the next, his helmet rolling into the snow. We grew afraid of the open sky, afraid of standing too tall, even afraid of the silence, for silence meant the sniper was waiting. Once, while crawling through debris, I felt a bullet strike the brick just inches from my head. Dust filled my mouth, and I pressed myself flat, certain the next round was already coming. It didn't. Why he spared me, I will never know. Perhaps he had another target. Perhaps he hesitated, as I had once hesitated. In time, the enemy became less a faceless foe and more like a dark reflection. They starved as we did, froze as we did, buried their dead as we buried ours. One evening, as snow fell heavy, I heard singing from across the ruins. A Russian voice, low and rough, carrying a mournful tune I did not understand. The notes drifted over the shattered city like smoke. None of us fired that night. We listened, silent, each lost in his own thoughts. For a moment, the war faded, and it was only men huddled against the cold, clinging to scraps of humanity. But such moments were rare. More often, encounters ended in blood. I recall a patrol through a shattered warehouse. We found a Russian soldier huddled behind crates, his leg mangled, unable to move. He raised his hand slowly, eyes pleading. Our sergeant did not hesitate. A single shot ended him. I wanted to speak, to protest, but the words never left my throat. Mercy had no place in Stalingrad. It was kill or be killed, and any softness might mean death for you or for the man beside you. Still, the guilt lingered. It clung like frost to the soul, impossible to scrape away. The city itself became a third enemy, as dangerous as either side's guns. Walls collapsed without warning, burying men alive. Fires roared suddenly in the night, sparked by shells, consuming what little shelter we had. Once, after a bombardment, we dug through rubble to find 3 comrades trapped beneath. Only one was alive, coughing blood as we pulled him free. He died hours later, whispering his mother's name. Through it all, the Russians pressed harder. They fought with a ferocity I had never known, as if the city itself gave them strength. They appeared from tunnels, from sewers, from holes in the earth we never saw coming. No matter how many we killed, more rose to take their place. I began to believe Stalingrad itself fought us, that the bricks and stones were theirs, not ours, and would never yield. And yet, despite the slaughter, there were still glimmers of strange humanity. I once traded a cigarette for a scrap of bread with a Russian prisoner before he was marched away. We locked eyes for only a second, and in that second, I saw no enemy, only another man as hungry, as tired, as broken as myself. Those encounters haunted me more than the battles, because they reminded me of what we all were before the war stripped it away. Young men who should have been living, not killing. Men who, in another life, might have shared a drink, a story, even friendship. But in Stalingrad, friendship was replaced by bullets, and life was rationed out in moments, as fragile and fleeting as the snowflakes that fell on the ruins around us. By the time winter deepened, the promise of victory had withered into dust. The rumors we once dismissed became undeniable truths. We were surrounded, cut off from supplies, trapped in a shrinking pocket of ruin and snow. The officers still barked about holding the line, about reinforcements that never came, but their words rang hollow, swallowed by the gnawing emptiness in our stomachs. The city was quieter now, though not with peace. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of men too starved to speak, too cold to curse. Our uniforms hung loose from our wasted bodies, and our cheeks sank into hollow caves. When I looked at my comrades, I no longer saw soldiers. I saw scarecrows draped in rags, stumbling shadows who clung to their rifles only because their hands remembered the weight of them. Hunger became a madness. We boiled wallpaper scraped from the walls, chewing the glue that once held families' homes together. I watched men dig into horse carcasses, frozen stiff in the snow, hacking off slabs of meat with bayonets. Once, I saw a man gnawing at the heel of a frozen boot, eyes wild, as if the leather might transform into bread if he only believed hard enough. Some whispered darker tales that men had begun eating more than horses. I never saw it myself, but I could not doubt it. Hunger gnawed away at morality until nothing remained but instinct. We had stopped being soldiers. We were animals in uniform, clawing for survival. The cold worsened as supplies vanished. Our greatcoats stiffened with frost, and the breath from our mouths crystallized on our collars. I lost the feeling in 2 fingers of my left hand. The medic told me the flesh was dead, but I kept the hand wrapped tight in rags, unwilling to face the knife. I had seen men lose fingers, toes, whole feet to frostbite. They screamed as the blackened parts were cut away, then fell silent forever days later. Shelling continued, though less frequent. Perhaps the Russians knew we were already broken, that starvation would finish what their bullets could not. Still, when the artillery came, it shattered the fragile silence. I remember one barrage that struck a church we used as shelter. The walls groaned, then collapsed, burying half a dozen men beneath stone and dust. Our cries lasted through the night, muffled beneath rubble. We could not reach them. By morning, the voices were gone. Command crumbled along with everything else. Orders contradicted one another. Officers argued in whispers, and the men stopped saluting altogether. The once proud machine of the Wehrmacht had rusted into chaos. Some units deserted their posts, seeking food or firewood. Others vanished into the ruins, never to be seen again. Discipline, honor, loyalty, all the words drilled into us since training meant nothing in the frozen graveyard Stalingrad had become. I remembered the face of my lieutenant, once so sharp and proud, now gray and hollow. He gathered us one night and tried to speak of duty, of the fatherland, but his voice cracked. He looked down at his own trembling hands and said nothing more. The silence that followed was worse than any speech. In that silence, I realized even he no longer believed. Disease swept through what remained of us. Dysentery left men doubled over in agony, too weak to rise from the snow. Typhus crept in, carried by lice we could not rid ourselves of. The moans of the sick filled every cellar, every shattered room. Death came without fanfare. One moment, a comrade coughed beside you. The next, his head lolled forward, and he was gone. We grew numb to it, unable to mourn. The dead were everywhere, too many to bury. We simply pushed them aside to make space for the living. Despite everything, we still fought when the Russians advanced. But it was no longer battle, it was slaughter. They came with fresh troops, well fed and clothed, while we stumbled through the snow, rifles shaking in our hands. Our bullets were few, our grenades fewer, and often we had nothing to fight with but bayonets. I remember charging once, screaming though my voice cracked, only to feel my legs give out before I even reached the enemy. I lay gasping in the snow while others fought around me, and I thought, absurdly, that perhaps it would be easier simply to let the snow cover me. Surrender became a word whispered in shadows. To speak it aloud was dangerous. Officers still threatened execution for defeatism, but the thought grew in every mind. Could it be worse than this? Could captivity be more terrible than the hunger, the cold, the endless death? Some thought yes, some thought no, but all of us wondered. I saw men snap under the weight of it all. One soldier, Carl, walked out into the open one morning, rifle slung over his shoulder. He shouted at him to come back, but he did not answer. A sniper's shot cracked, and he fell face first into the snow. I do not think he wanted to die by the bullet. He only wanted to stop living as we did. By January, it was clear we had no hope. Circled, starved, frozen. Our army was nothing but a shell. And yet, still, the orders came. Fight, hold, endure. The words rang hollow in the ruins, for we knew we were already dead men walking. And through it all, I clung to the one thought that kept me breathing. Not today, not yet. I whispered it each morning as I forced myself to rise from the frozen ground. I whispered it when hunger tore at my belly, when frost bit my fingers, when I stepped over the bodies of comrades who had whispered the same prayer and failed. Not today. Even prayers freeze in Stalingrad. By the final weeks, Stalingrad was no longer a city, but a tomb. The snow lay heavy across the ruins, covering the bodies that lined the streets, softening the edges of horror, but never hiding it. The air stank of smoke, sickness, and death, the smell that clung to our clothes, our skin, even our thoughts. I had grown so thin that my belt hung loose, my ribs sharp beneath the gray coat. Each step was agony, each breath a burden, and yet I walked still, though I often wondered how. The Russians closed in from every side. Their artillery hammered us without pause, shattering what little shelter remained. At night, the sky glowed red with fire, and the ground trembled like a living thing. We no longer spoke of victory, not even of survival. We spoke of ending. Men prayed for surrender, others prayed for death. Some prayed for nothing at all, their eyes already empty. I remember the last letter I tried to write. My pencil shook in my hand, the words uneven on the paper. I wanted to tell my mother I loved her, that I was sorry, that I thought of home every night in this frozen hell. But the page remained half empty, because I could not imagine the words reaching her. The city had swallowed too many letters, too many men. I tucked it into my pocket anyway, a silent message to a world I might never see again. When the surrender finally came, it did not feel like deliverance. It felt like collapse. Our officers, once proud, now stood with hollow eyes, their pistols trembling in their hands. Some shot themselves rather than face captivity. Others tore off their insignia and wept openly. The rest of us laid down our weapons slowly, reluctantly, as if letting go of the rifles that had become extensions of our bodies meant surrendering the last shred of ourselves. The Russians marched us out of the ruins, column by column. Snow fell lightly that morning, the flakes landing on the frozen faces of the dead as we passed them by. We did not speak. There was no strength left for words. I looked at the Russians around me, their coats thick, their eyes wary, and I wondered if they saw us as men or merely shadows of men. We stumbled through the snow, prisoners now, but still alive if such a word could still be used. The road to captivity was worse than battle. Men collapsed in the snow, too weak to continue, and were left where they fell. Some begged for water, but there was none. I watched Muller, the one who had once caught a crow for U.S. Stogger, fall to his knees and never rise again. I wanted to stop to help him, but the column moved forward, and I was carried with it like a leaf in a river. I looked back only once, and the snow had already begun to cover him. Days blurred into one another, a march of silence and frost. I do not remember how many of us began, only how few of us remained when we reached the camps. There, I found myself among strangers. Men from my unit, scattered, were gone. Their faces replaced by others, equally hollow, equally lost. Kayla, I learned quickly that survival in captivity was no different than survival in Stalingrad. Cling to scraps, endure the cold, whisper the same prayer, not today. Kayla, I cannot explain why. Perhaps I was stronger, though I doubt it. Perhaps I was luckier, though luck seemed long vanished from Stalingrad. Or perhaps it was nothing more than stubbornness, the refusal to surrender to death, even when death seemed the only certainty. Years have passed since then, but the memories have not. They linger like ghosts, pressing close in the silence of night. I see the faces of comrades who did not return, hear the crack of rifles, smell the acrid smoke of burning walls. I wake in a warm bed, yet still feel the frost creeping into my bones. Stalingrad does not release its survivors. It holds them forever, etched into the soul like frost into stone. I survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad against all odds, but survival is not victory. It is a burden, a reminder carried each day for those who could not escape. I close my eyes. I am back there in the ruins, whispering the same prayer into the icy wind. Not today. Not today.